Today, I want to talk to you about a really interesting claim. It's a little bit well known because it's been written up and argued in at least two very popular books. This claim appears in Sapiens by Noah Yuval Harari, and it also appears in Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. And I am going to read you that claim, but I'm not going to read it to you from either of those two books. Neither of those books are written by professional anthropologists, and neither of those books are very well sourced. So I have a different book here. This is printed out from my ebook copy of Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States by James C. Scott. And James Scott is a professional anthropologist who is very meticulous in his sources. He starts off by talking about sort of the project of big history, of long history. And he gives us an overview of human society. Quote, Homo sapiens appeared as a subspecies about 200,000 years ago and is found outside of Africa and the Levant no more than 60,000 years ago. The first evidence of cultivated plants and of sedentary communities appears roughly 12,000 years ago. Okay, so only 12,000 years, James Scott says, have we been sedentary, have we been domesticating plants and animals. He continues, until then, that is to say, for 95% of the human experience on Earth, we lived in small, mobile, dispersed, relatively egalitarian hunting and gathering bands. Now, that's just the context, that's just the history. That's not really the claim. The claim is more dramatic than that. The claim is that the transition from the hunter-gatherer society to the domesticated society, the society of domesticating plants and animals, was a mistake, was a disastrous mistake. Skipping ahead in the book, Scott says, contrary to earlier assumptions, hunters and gatherers, even today, in the marginal refugia they inhabit, are nothing like the famished, one day away from starvation desperados of folklore. Hunters and gatherers have, in fact, never looked so good in terms of their diet, their health, and their leisure. Agriculturalists, on the contrary, have never looked so bad in terms of their diet, their health, and their leisure. Thus, while the planting of crops has seemed in the standard narrative a crucial step toward a utopian present, it cannot have looked that way to those who first experienced it. He goes on later in the book to describe the process of domestication, the process of inventing agriculture. He says, the new crops became basket cases, which could not survive without our constant attentions and protection. Much the same was true for domesticated sheep and goats, which became smaller, more placid, less aware of their surroundings, and less sexually dimorphic. By comparing the life world of agriculture, strapped as it is to the metronome of a major cereal grain, with the life world of the hunter-gatherer, I make the case that the life of farming is comparatively far narrower, experientially, and in both a cultural and ritual sense, more impoverished. He goes on to talk about how domestication led to the emergence of all sorts of new diseases. It led to a kind of vulnerability to the seasons and the whims of the natural world that could wipe out an entire crop and lead to mass starvation. And so it seems that we have this trauma in our history. We have this movement, this migration that had profound effects on our life and created a kind of detachment, a kind of exile from our atavistic, evolutionary context, the world that we used to inhabit and were evolved to inhabit. And so perhaps it might be reasonable to expect that this kind of historical trauma makes its way into our literature, into the mythologies that we tell about our history. And you wouldn't be wrong. In fact, one of the most famous books of all time, seems to describe a very similar kind of process. And of course, I'm talking about the Metamorphoses by Ovid. The Metamorphoses by Ovid begins by talking about the creation of man and the history of the world. And it says that the earth goes through 5 different ages, starting at a golden age, then a silver age, then a brass age, then an iron age. Maybe it's just 4 ages. Ovid writes in Book 1, Fable 3, quote, "The golden age was first founded, which, without any avenger, of its own accord, without laws, practiced both faith and rectitude. Punishment and fear of it did not exist. Skipping, the pine tree cut from its native mountains had not yet descended to the flowing waves, that it might visit a foreign region, and mortals were acquainted with no shores beyond their own. Without occasion for soldiers, the minds of men, free from care, enjoyed an easy tranquility. The earth itself, too, in freedom, untouched by the harrow, and wounded by no plowshares, of its own accord produced everything, and men, contented with the food created under no compulsion, gathered the fruit of the arbut tree and the strawberries of the mountain." The standard reading of the Garden of Eden story, as it appears in the book of Genesis, is a story of rebellion, a story of sin, a story of temptation and exile. We generally take for granted the Miltonic reading of the Garden of Eden, where man's first disobedience brought pain and suffering and sin into the world and is the source of all our woe, and that the serpent tempted Eve and Eve tempted Adam, and before that they lived in a state of innocence, kind of blissful innocence, and afterwards their eyes were opened to maybe a kind of sexual maturity and a kind of lust. But another way to read that same story is as a kind of metaphor for this transition, where the Garden of Eden, like the Golden Age in Ovid Metamorphoses, is that context, the 200,000 years of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and Eve's innovation, the revolution she precipitates, is to ask questions about the natural world, is to seek an understanding, a deeper understanding, a knowledge of good and evil, an experimental method, testing things, trying things that were assumed to be forbidden, seeing what happens, experimenting, a desire to try to move beyond the confines of what nature is providing and trying to domesticate, trying to exploit the land, work the land, and generate more than the land naturally provides. When Adam and Eve are exiled, Adam's punishment is that he will have to work the land, that he will have to bring bread with his toil. And Adam and Eve's children in the Bible story are Cain and Abel. And we know from the next stories in the Bible that Cain and Abel were shepherds and farmers respectively. That was made possible by leaving the garden. And so that story of Eden is such a powerful story and such an important story because it captures something so profound in our collective memory, and it captures the sense in which we look around and we do feel fallen. We do indeed inhabit a post-lapsarian world. We are indeed living exiled from our evolutionary environment. We're exiled and we can't go back. It was an inexorable, irreversible change. And we might long or yearn for Eden, but there's no going back to Eden. I've been thinking about the Eden story because I'm currently doing a read-along with some friends of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. And like the Eden story, like the book of Genesis, it tells a story over many generations. Like the Eden story, it is a book about the interplay between personal time, individual lives, and historical time, historical processes that are changing and evolving and marching inexorably into the future. And to me, when I read this book, despite it not being the unimpeachable and infinitely transcendent Word of God, when I read 100 Years of Solitude, I am reading a story. I am getting the sense of a kind of fall, another kind of expulsion. The book tells the story of this town of Macondo, which is founded by Jose Arcadio Buendia and his wife Ursula. And we're told in the beginning, Marquez tells us that the world was new and things didn't even have names yet. And it starts in this kind of Eden-like paradise where no one has died and it's gorgeous and people have what they need. And page after page, story after story, we get the waves of history, the waves of progress lapping on this town. Forces of technology and scientific discovery and new forms of communication and foreigners, immigration coming into the town, and politics and war. We move from a world which is Eden-like and pure and innocent and magical and mysterious till the end of the book where we find ourselves squarely in the modern, in a world of airplanes and train stations and clocks. And it's about that progression, and it captures a deep sense that there's something lost. The famous first sentence of the book: many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Arellano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. And in that first sentence, you get the sense in which time folds in on itself. The way everything in this book happens as though in a dream, as though in a memory. And the logic of the book, the logic of the narrative, is the logic of dreams. And the reason Colonel Arellano Buendia remembers ice when he faced the firing squad is because for him, living in this tropical climate, seeing ice for the first time was the most unimaginable revelation. Towards the middle of the book, the great-grandchild of Ursula, who's the matriarch, is named Arellano Segundo, and he's reading a book. Quote, Arellano Segundo was deep in the reading of a book. Although it had no cover and the title did not appear anywhere, the boy enjoyed the story of a woman who sat at a table and ate nothing but kernels of rice, which he picked up with a pin, and the story of the fisherman who borrowed a weight for his net from a neighbor, and when he gave him a fish in payment later, it had a diamond in its stomach, and the one about the lamp that fulfilled wishes, and about flying carpets. And so already at this point, it seems like the book that Arellano Segundo is reading is in the same genre of 100 Years of Solitude. He's reading these fantastical stories about this sort of mythological time, not unlike 100 Years of Solitude itself. And he asks a question to his great-grandmother. Surprised, he asked Ursula if all that was true. And she answered him that it was. That many years ago, the gypsies had brought magic lamps and flying mats to Macondo. And we know this to be true from the beginning of the book, because in the beginning of the book, the gypsies do come to Macondo and they bring all sorts of magical things, including magic carpets. Ursula continues, what's happening, she sighed, is that the world is slowly coming to an end. And those things don't come here anymore. And that's what it is, the inexorable processes of time and modernity that change the nature and the texture of our experiences. 100 Years of Solitude is a very hard book to describe or to summarize because it's really an experience that you just have to have for yourself. You're not connected really to any of the characters. It doesn't have a lot of the same kind of narrative thrust or plot arcs or character arcs that you'd expect to see in works of fiction. It's so unique because it's operating in a different kind of space. It's operating in the space of nostalgia and the space of memory and the space of human beings adapting and living and making sense of a changing world. Human beings who are finding themselves increasingly fallen, increasingly exiled from the landscape of their youth and of their memory. That world of our childhood to which we can never return.